Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning into the Liberty Report. With me today is Chris Rossini, our co-host. Chris, welcome to the program.
Morning, Dr. Paul.
Very good. I want to talk about cryptocurrencies and dollar hegemony. This is something I've talked about for many, many years, and a lot more people are talking about now, especially with the development of the cryptocurrencies and what is the relationship between the two. And I find this very fascinating, and I think to understand this, I think people should understand the principles of sound money. And that is something I've talked about for many, many years, and I think it's more important than ever that we define what sound money is and why it was of a certain nature for centuries, not centuries, thousands of years, and why if there's going to be a replacement for the dollar, we have to consider this. This is a serious issue. So why don't you update us once again, like we have in the past, to remind people about where sound money comes from, how money originates. It isn't a declaration by government and say, oh, okay, let's print this piece of paper and it's going to be money. It came about in a quite different manner than that.
Yes. In fact, if you take out a dollar bill, you'd never know that money was created in the marketplace. It now has been totally monopolized by government. But over thousands of years, like you mentioned, through countless market transactions, we can't even count how many there were over the entire world, people settled on, to get away from barter, a medium of exchange that would work. And gold and silver for thousands of years have always been chosen because they have all the properties necessary to be money. It was only afterwards that government came in for its own reasons and monopolized it for themselves, because they figured if they control the money supply, they could pay for whatever they want, their wars, their welfare, they could finance themselves. So they monopolized it for themselves, and it has become their most prized possession. You could strip government of all of its assets, but leave it one thing to be able to create money, and it'll buy it all back.
Yes.
So that's how we got to where we are today.
Yes, and it isn't like the commodity standard of money, the metals replacing barter, didn't have its ups and downs. It's just not in this century. It just wasn't in the 19th century. The ups and downs have always been there because, as you described, governments come in and they want a monopoly and they take it over, and that's how they can expand their powers, develop all kinds of things for the special interest. So that has happened, but when you look at the long trend of the centuries, gold was known to be precious and known about 6,000 years ago, but really got to be used in commerce 3,000 years ago. So that's a long time. And then even in our American history, it's been an ups and downs, with continental money and the greenbacks in the Civil War period. But I want to talk about, the superiority of the dollar hegemony, which is an important event because the thesis of what we're talking about right now is the end of that. Dollar hegemony, dollar control, empires. And it, to me, is very significant. And I spoke out strongly on many occasions in Washington on this issue. And I sincerely believe that dollar hegemony is ending. But where did it come from? How did it happen? If you can't create money out of thin air, how did government get hold of paper money and fiat money and have so much power? Well, the dollar had to start from the marketplace, defined as a precious metal. And throughout our history, it was defined as metal. Matter of fact, the last link didn't occur until 1971, and that's why I talk about 1971. That link was removed when the Bretton Woods Agreement fell apart. But during the time between 1913 and 1971, it was systematically removed. But why then did it become the reserve currency of the world? The conditions of the post-World War II period. We were spared all the devastation of World War II and World War I. European countries were devastated. And guess what? We had most of the gold. We had well over 500 million ounces of gold in 1945. So we had a good economy. We were still unscathed from the war. we had some problems, but the other nations were in bad shape. So when the Bretton Woods Agreement was agreed in 1945, of course, in spite of the fact that Harry Dexter White there tried to prevent this from happening, it ended up with the Americans winning that argument. The dollar didn't win the argument, but the Americans, our government, won the argument by getting the dollar defined as gold. People still weren't allowed to own it. We weren't allowed to own gold. We won that fight, but we had the control. It became the reserve currency of the world. And guess what? We got rid of the British pound as the reserve currency of the world. The pound remained. Just because you remove it as a reserve currency, you don't really always get rid of it. You might do it in a smaller country. I don't expect the dollar to be disappeared. I think there will be a dollar, but it'll be a new form. And most likely for it to really work, it will have a definition. It will be defined by something of real value. And that, of course, is what we had, even though we had a lot of currencies, prior to the breakdown of the Bretton Woods Agreement, each currency was defined as a weight in gold, and therefore they operated more freely. But now, what my argument is 1971 ushered in a very, very unusual age in monetary history, something that was never seen before. It persists, and some people who are making a lot of money right now say, hey, it's great. What do we have to worry about? But there's a lot of people who are worried about it in spite of what the markets are doing. There's a lot of concerns out there, and that things aren't quite as rosy as our governments and our central banks portray. Quite frankly, and fortunately, I think central banking is on the defensive. And if we're able to undermine a dollar hegemony and fiat currencies, we will be undermining the power of the central bank. Hopefully it will be a step in the right direction of restoring and emphasizing the true purpose of what government should be all about, and that is the protection of liberty. But Chris, I'm sure you have thought about some of the problems that we face today that people aren't talking about, but they're related to some of the things that emphasize the fact that the system isn't quite as rosy as it is portrayed.
Yes, back when the our central bank was created in 1913, America was in great economic shape, and this dollar hegemony that you speak of has to do with what happened over the next century. We've been at war for a good century, from World War I, which was right after the Fed was created, and a great argument could be made that we would have never went to World War I if there was no Fed, and it just continued through the Soviet Union, all the Vietnams, North Koreas, and finally we indirectly declared bankruptcy in 1971, August 15th. And now it's just, we're fighting against supply and demand. At some point, this dollar system is going out, and there's a lot of hype that cryptocurrencies are going to take it over. I'm not so sure about that.
How that's going to work. But along with this fact that the dollar was the reserve currency of the world and we were in charge, and we were financing many wars, financing even the other countries as we do now. We send a lot of weapons even to our enemies that we're fighting. We pay for that. The Keynesian system was delighted because they believe in deficits and that they're worthwhile and that it causes good economic growth. And they don't believe in debt. But those things that you talked about, war, it is all run up by debt. And the debt burden can be something that can be delayed in payment. It's always paid for. The debt always has to get paid for by the debasement of the currency, devaluation of the currency, because you can't keep printing it. They say, well, so far they are doing it. But no, there's a lot of debasement going on. Just think if you measured it in terms of gold, which is a convenient way to measure the value of a dollar, it was $20 an ounce when the Fed took over. Now it's $1,250 an ounce, and probably is going to go a lot higher. So the debasement is occurring in order to liquidate the debt, but the debt is just huge. And I think one fascinating statistic right now is the amount of non-interest bearing debt that our central banks hold. There's over $9 trillion, and there's no interest earned. There's a lot of people out there, and they still float these bonds, and the system is psyched up. Well, you buy them. What else are you going to buy? You buy bonds, and there might be negative interest rates. Well, that tells me this is not viable. This is fiction. And so a lot of people, I think, sense this more than that you can see on the surface. And I argue the case that dollar hegemony is ending, and therefore the search for an alternative currency is out there. So don't we have some people, Chris, looking at it, in the Far East? I think there's some people in China and Japan and Russia and other countries are looking for that substitute, and maybe they can take over the role of a reserve currency.
Yes, this whatever is going to replace the dollar, this is a very tricky time, because if we can see that it's ending, they see it too. And I'm sure they're preparing and will want things to go their way. And obviously, cryptocurrencies popped out of nowhere, and they're the big craze. But governments and central banks, they're not bashful. They want to get rid of cash. They tell us all the time. And obviously, they like surveillance. And it's all electronic. The government bureaucrats aren't following everyone around with a pen and paper. They're just taking all of our electronic and financial communications. So cryptocurrencies fit into this idea. It abolishes cash, and they can be used to surveil all of our financial transactions. So whichever way this goes, it could be good or bad, and we just have to watch it, I guess.
There was one article out by somebody who was very positive on cryptocurrencies, and of course that fits into the model of competition in currencies, which I'm strongly for. But his argument was almost reverse of mine. He said he doesn't emphasize the problem of the dollar hegemony and what it has wrought, and the need for a new reserve currency. His argument was, well, all of a sudden we have invented this thing called a cryptocurrency, and it's magic, and it can be used as money, and it can hurry on and bring about the demise of dollar hegemony. I see dollar hegemony as dissipating and disappearing, and therefore giving the motivation to look for things, whether it's a Chinese yuan gold standard or whether it's a cryptocurrency. I think that is the motivation. The big question we have is, what is the best substitute? Because there are so many problems out there, and I can't emphasize more about the problem of debt and spending and malinvestment and all the distortion. And in the course of this dissipation and disappearance, of the dollar hegemony, which started in '71 specifically, that 2009 was a big year for this too, because we had a recession that was not typical. And then they created trillions and trillions of dollars in central bank, and the people didn't use it up. GDP never kept up with the amount of dollars that were created. So this is another period of time that emphasizes, again, the end stages of the dollar fiat currency reserve. But the big question is how is it going to be replaced? Now, if we look at history, if they're able to replace this, even if it's a private currency, but it isn't definable by something of real value, what they're doing is substituting or eliminating and forgetting about history. They have actually changed history, because that hasn't happened before. That has never happened. Most people can understand that if a group of people got stranded on an island and they had to survive on their own, and they had to go back to bartering or something, they say, well, you know what we need is a central bank. We need somebody printing money. And somebody else says, yeah, and I brought my computer along. I think I can help you do that. Nobody would think this is serious. You have to produce. You have to have stuff. Then you have to transfer it back and forth. Then you have to be able to define value. And right now, the one thing that is not going to be reversed very easily, the power of the reserve currency can be disturbed, But you're not going to remove the world's desires and the people of America ever for using the dollar, because everybody thinks about the dollar. Whether you're dealing in cryptocurrencies or gold or silver or stocks or bonds, you always talk about dollars. And that is going to last. They'll keep thinking about dollars. The dollar is what measures the value. But it's not going to happen that all of a sudden we'll say, well, how many ounces of gold, in spite of how positive I am on gold. They're never going to come around and say, well, let's do this deal in gold. Well, they might do it in deal, and they're allowed to do that in gold, but they would first have to say, well, how much money you want? $500,000. Okay, how many ounces of gold that is? You still go back to the value of gold. And that is the case, with the cryptocurrencies. You still deal in dollars. Somebody suggested the other day, I saw it on the internet, and said, well, I have this very, very fancy house, and I want Bitcoin for it. Well, it's okay. Somebody might make a trade, and some of those trades have already been done, but it's not going to be an everyday transaction, because immediately, Chris, if you and I were exchanging a house, and I said, well, I want Bitcoin from you, Chris, and you say, well, how much you want for your house? Oh, I want $200,000. Well, how many Bitcoins are that? So the people will still think and price in dollar terms, and dollars are still instrumental because of its origin. The mess we have is because we destroyed the value. It's like taking a measuring rod. It's like taking the yardstick and saying, the yardstick is great. It's great for measuring things. But we want to change that and have a yardstick that doesn't work. That's where we are with our currency now. It's declared, and you can't do economic calculations. And if you do, they're wrong. How can you decide how to invest in something if there's no interest rates? How can you figure out what the cost of savings are, and how do you promote savings if there's no interest? This thing is a big mess, and it is coming to an end, and it will not be smooth. And my suggestion is we don't know what will replace it, and we don't know how long it's going to take. But I believe there's going to be a lot of disruption. There's a lot of people dependent on welfare. The military-industrial complex loves warfare, and they're addicted to this, and something will have to change. But what we're seeing, and what I've been watching, especially since 1971, that was a moment of enlightenment for me. You mean there will be no connection, in spite of all the erosion the years before that, no connection to anything of real value. It had lasted, even in '68, we could still turn in a Federal Reserve note or a dollar and get a silver ounce. But then that ended in '68. You couldn't even do that. So now there's no link whatsoever, and this has ushered in this age of radical Keynesianism, deficit financing, and with no rudder, no steering, and no guide. And yet, people have been deceived into thinking, how wonderful it is because the stock market is up. Well, there's more to it than that. And I think this is very serious in discussing and fully understanding the nature of money and what the replacement has to be.
Yes, I'll finish up, Dr. Paul, with a couple final thoughts. First, like I said, government's number one prized possession is the monopoly of money. And if they see value in cryptocurrency, which I think they will, then they'll use every force of the law and any force available to them to monopolize it and control it themselves. And finally, in this crypto craze, a lot of libertarianism has been wrapped up in it, that people are going into debt to go buy these cryptocurrencies. But this has nothing to do with libertarianism or liberty. Liberty is based on the principle of non-aggression, and that's it. What type of money is used and what people are doing. And for people that want to know about sound money, please look at all of Dr. Paul's books, his speeches, shows that we've done, and it'll give you a better idea of how sound money can come back.
Very good, and I'd like to close by mentioning an issue that I think is important. I saw an article just today about the opioid epidemic. Everybody knows about it, and the president's going to deal with it, and they're going to get rid of it, and it's all going to be through government authoritarianism, not quite willing to compare it to other things that cause a lot of death, like alcoholism and other drugs, and how many people die on government highways. Nevertheless, the opioid epidemic was said to be, somebody did a study and they said the reason that there is it is because of the destruction of the white working class. Now, I don't know how they studied it and whether that's the case. I mean, it's interesting to think that the white working class is suffering, and they made their point on why they are. But isn't that interesting that if the white working class is having problem as part of this problem that I'm describing, I've never used that before, but as part of the problem of the underemployment and the labor participation rate and the real inflation is there. But here, the white working force are injured and they're going to opium. I'm not saying that is true or not, but that is a connection. If there is a connection between the two, I would say the demise of the white working class is related to this economic system that we have, and we have to look at the economic system. But I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. I find this fascinating and a very important issue, something I've dealt with for many, many years. I wished it weren't so serious because I'd have more fun talking about it. But because I think it's serious, I'm going to continue to talk about it because it's very important as we go through the next phase of deciding and participating in the debate on what is going to replace the dollar hegemony and what the next reserve currency will be. Very simply, the reserve currency could be not dictated and not declared. It could be that all money, no matter what you call it, should be defined as a weight of precious metals. And you could have a cryptocurrency that does that. You could have a dollar that does that. But you have to have it connected to something of real value. That's what history tells us. If we're disproven about this, we'll wait and see what happens as long as there's no force or fraud. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.